The next person we have is our thankfully unchallenged, because everyone, uh, uh, feels the same way that we do, that she's great and right where she belongs. Our Rep Ann-Margaret Ferrante of the 5th Essex District. And she is actually going to introduce our speaker tonight, her colleague, Nika Elugardo of the 15th Suffolk. So Rep, if you want to take it away.
Thank you, Matt. And but before I introduce Nika, my colleague Nika, I'd like to, Matt, thank you and all the committee members for all of the work that you do, not just when it comes to election time, but throughout the whole year. So to all of you, thank you for all of the effort, and I thank you in advance for all of the effort over the next coming weeks. I am going to introduce my esteemed colleague, Representative Nika Elugardo. Before I do, I want to tell you a little bit about her education. She has a Bachelor of Science from MIT in Urban Planning. She has a law degree, Juris Doctorate, from Boston University Law School. She has a Master in Public Policy from the Harvard Kennedy School. I came to know Nika 2 years ago when some of us thought she was crazy for challenging the then chairman of Ways and Means, Jeff Sanchez. And I don't think in the history of the Massachusetts legislature, any challenger has successfully primaried a chairman of Ways and Means. And so when she took this bold action, she got all of our attention. And to her credit, she won that primary and was sworn in as a representative. She has very strong progressive positions, and she's a member of the Black and Latino Caucus. I asked her to come to speak to us today about the subject of police reform. And one of the reasons I wanted her to come and share her perspectives is because in her district, she has a greater population of African Americans, and she is also African American. And I think it's important for those of us in communities that don't have a high population of people of color, that we really listen to those who do, so that we understand the issues better. And I believe that it helps us to be better allies in the long run. So with that, my gratitude and appreciation to Rep. Elugardo for being with us tonight to share her perspective with us, especially in this time of racial sensitivity and hopefully progressive movement toward healing some of the racial divisions and injustices that we've had in our country. So thank you, Nika. I look forward to hearing from you tonight, as do I think my fellow members do here at the Democratic City Committee.
Thank you, Rep. Ferrante. And Ann-Margaret has been a great mentor to me, and I think to many others, but she is very generous, even being, I think, one of the younger people who is in leadership. She's one of the more experienced people in the State House, and it's been fun to encounter leaders and women who will make sure that you know the ropes. And so thank you for that, Ann-Margaret. And you may be surprised to know that that's not always how everybody approaches leadership. so you've got, as I've heard you say already, a really special person. And then thanks also to the Gloucester City Committee, Democratic Committee. I love Gloucester. I feel really welcome there. I feel really comfortable there. It has a great culture that reminds me of my own roots. Even though I grew up in Ohio, there are parts of Massachusetts that have the parts of the Midwest that I like the best. I've been here 30 years, so I like it better in New England. But certain elements I miss living in the big city of Boston, and being down to earth and real is one of them. And so that's one of the things I really enjoy about Gloucester. It's no shortage of folks that'll just tell it like it is. And so really happy to be here with you tonight. So Ann-Margaret asked me to speak about the policing bill. And the policing bill has passed the House and Senate and is now with conference committee. So I'm going to just talk briefly about the origins of that bill, how we ended up doing it, and then what the major components of it, just a little story, a tiny bit of the story of like, what's the holdup at this point? And really, people are working really hard at this point. But I think it's a great case study in how politics is not static, and neither is policymaking, and the role that you folks can have in different stages really changes depending on the stage of the legislation. And so while a lot of advocates will sort of pull out their hammer of calling your legislator, you've got Ann-Margaret, right? So there's only so many times you can call her and say the same thing. So what are the other things that affect and move policy? I've been learning that in my 2 years. I've learned it from colleagues. I've learned it from my short experience. But before we dive into that, and I'll just point out, I put the link up, and a link in the chat from the Black and Latino Caucus's request, essentially, for this policing bill, to give a little context. But before I say that, I have to shout out the phone banking. So your phone banking every week, I heard today, I heard you talking about it, and Matt mentioned it to me in our previous conversation, and that is so powerful. I mean, I've been told that phone banks increase voter turnout by 3% on average, and I'm sure in some places it's more. I bet it's going to be more this year, right? And depending on when you started phone banking, you might be responsible for some of those 18 million that have already voted across the country. And it's so, so critical. And all of you are veterans, but I love to say this over and over because of my personal experience running a tough race last session. It doesn't matter as much how you feel or even how you feel they feel about you. What really matters is how they actually felt when you hung up. So even if they were irritated at you, but you were respectful and informative, then that person might still do something they wouldn't have done before, even if they don't tell you that. And that was certainly the experience in my election, where afterwards I had people say, 7 people called me on election day. 8 people knocked on my door, which I know we're not doing that on election day, but to the point of like, people don't want to hear from us. They didn't want to hear it. And yet it took 8 times for them to get out and vote. So you might be that first call or the 6th call or the 8th call, but you made a vote. You were part of that. And thank you for passing that message on to so many people. So back to the policing bill. We all know at this point that George Floyd, the events surrounding George Floyd's murder, that was a tipping point for our country and certainly for our state and all 351 towns and communities across it. And it wasn't just a tipping point in the sense of like an awareness of folks who weren't Black or weren't African American or weren't people of color. It was a tipping point in terms of people, even those who were already aware, wow, there's racism in our country. And the racism in our country is in every sector of society, including in policing. And what can we do about that? But it was also a tipping point in terms of action, the what can we do about it part. No longer just accepting it as something that's too bad, or if there are bad apples, there are bad apples, but really realizing this word that has been bandied about for a lot more lately than early on, structural racism, right? And that means it's actually not just the bad apples issue. That means us good apples, Black, white, brown, Native, wherever we may be from, all of us are impacted by just how our country came about and the narratives that we have told each other and viewed for a long, long time. And the laws that we've drafted have been a part of that. All of you know that if you're all from one neighborhood trying to make a decision for the whole city, it doesn't matter how well-meaning you are, people aren't going to feel represented. I noticed that when you voted in people, the ward had to say, yeah, we accept you because you're from our ward. Well, same thing happens when laws get made over and over again by people that don't understand the experience in the Black community. And before this work, I did community and economic development work for about 20 plus years. And one of the projects I worked on, I had the opportunity to do some research with providers, including some police officers in some parts of Boston and greater Boston where I represent, that looked at training in structural racism, and this was with regards to health equity. And so police arresting people who have mental health issues and also intersect that with their people of color, right? And so what training was effective, what training was not effective in helping them understand when to call a social worker and how did race impact that versus arresting a person, or in addition to arresting a person sometimes. And when to recognize issues that are going on with folks around there. And what we discovered was really interesting in one city, Somerville. The training did not work, meaning the officers didn't like it and they thought it was a joke, when you were just giving them information about racial bias. But when you gave the historical context that helped the officers understand people of color are not reacting to you. They're reacting to a long history, a documented history of how they've been treated by authority, institutional figures, and just the system in general that you have not experienced. And a lot of white people in Somerville, similar to across the Commonwealth, being recent descendants from immigrants, second, third, fourth generation, they can relate to that because they can remember the stories of their grandparents being spit on, for example. And so when we talk about dismantling structural racism, that's a conversation that is more than an idea that you're not hating people, more than an idea that you're respecting people equally. It's also you're looking at what historically has been done and ways that it isn't representative and results in disproportionate impacts. And in that context, the bad actors, like the George Floyd actors, their actions are even more dangerous, right? Because they're not really isolated incidents, and the people experiencing them, like Black people across my district and beyond, the people experiencing them are not really just experiencing that incident, right? They're experiencing a whole range of things that are happening in housing and healthcare, redlining, grandparents issues, parents issues. How I personally, as a young woman in Boston when I came in 1991, was twice kicked out of malls. MIT kid, super geeky, just for sitting there and being Black. One guy told me, rich people come in here all the time and they don't want to see kids like you sitting here. That's in Boston in my lifetime. And that continues even till today. And that guy, I'm going to be honest with you, I probably wouldn't say this to, if I could even see, I can't see everybody, so I'm taking a risk. If I could see one African American, I wouldn't say this because I wouldn't want to traumatize anybody. But honestly, that guy was a really nice guy. He wasn't a bad apple. He was doing that because the guy, remember how we used to wear the wires in the 80s? Like when the guy upstairs had to communicate, they had the wire hanging down. He points up to a guy on the balcony with a wire. He said, "That's my boss, the guy in the suit." And he just, told me through my earpiece that I got to get you guys out of here. I feel really bad about it. So that's the structural problem. And bad apples in that system make it worse. Now, the reason I give that context is so that you understand why, when George Floyd happened, the Boston electeds of color, so I represent some communities in Boston and then a little bit of the town of Brookline, but there are 20 folks representing Boston, and a handful of us are electeds of color, but then we also have county representatives, we have a DA, Suffolk County probate, and we have city councilors, et cetera, and we have Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who is a person of color down in Congress. So at all levels of government, Boston has representatives of color, and we have been meeting every other week. And after COVID happened, we started meeting weekly. So when George Floyd happened, we had at that time 16 of us, a real tight relationship with each other, and we said, we have to do something about this that gets at the structural issues, not necessarily the sexy issues, not necessarily the social media issues, not necessarily what our neighbors are talking about. Those are all very important things, but really get nitty gritty into the geeky details of what's actually enabling these bad apple players to be out of control. But in places like Massachusetts, where in my opinion, We have some of the best officers in the country. Why do we still have challenges and problems? They're not going to be, in many cases, as severe as some of the stuff we hear nationally. But why aren't the problems zero? They should be. Those are what our values represent. And so in thinking of that, we said, okay, what is some low-hanging fruit? What is some low-hanging fruit that we can go back to the legislature, go back to Congress, go back to City Council, at all the 3 levels that we represent here, and say, hey, we can get these things done right now. Structural racism is a big problem, and we need to take it on in the legislature more intentionally and actively than we are, not only in policing, but in housing, education, et cetera. But today, and today then was the end of May, beginning in June of this year, today, what can we get done by this session, which at the time we thought was going to end on July 31st, didn't we, Ann-Margaret? And so what can we get done in a couple of months? And I was on the team being a state legislator that was assigned the state options. So if you click on that link, you'll see the 4 federal. There's a nice little graphic. You can go, I picked that one because you can go to the bottom. You can click around on that website to find more information. But there's 4 federal things that Ayanna Presley was working on in policing and policing related, 4 state items, which I'm gonna focus on, and 2 city items. That wasn't all we were doing in life, right? Like all of us were working on a bunch of stuff along with our other BIPOC and white allied progressive and other legislators actually, because anti-racism isn't actually just a progressive or democratic concept. It gets politicized that way, but we have great Republicans in Massachusetts anyway. I'm from Ohio. I say we have the best Republicans in the country in Massachusetts, although that's changing sometimes when we hear some of the stories we heard earlier. But anyway, there's a lot of people fighting for it. And we recognize that expungement and all this other stuff that we've been talking about, there's a ton that we can do. But what can we get done in 2 months? And for that, we came up with 4 things that have been sort of on the books trying to move their way through for years. And we thought now the time is right. Number 1, top of the list, police certification and decertification. Most states already do that. At least 46 other states already do that. And that means if you abuse your power as a police officer, not just in terms of violence, but in a wide variety of ways, not just related to race, but in a wide variety of ways, to the level where you lose your job, you will be decertified and you can't just go work somewhere else. And that's a really basic concept. And we've got certification in all kinds of things. And Margaret and I, we got to get recertified as lawyers if we want to keep our license up. But even my hairdresser has to do, a certification. So there's all kinds of things that need to be certified. And so Massachusetts has policy for that. And it turns out that Representative Russell Holmes, one of my colleagues on the Black Latino Caucus, have been working with Governor Baker for almost 8 years to develop a commission to study it. And we thought, hey, why not just do it? Because now is the moment. And so police certification and decertification. Number 2, civil service review. So the civil service exam, is what police officers and many other civil servants take, versions of that to, become public servants in those capacities. And right now, if you just look at the outcomes for police, even looking at like who goes in and recruitment, like let's say there's good recruitment, you don't get a lot of police officers of color or even just from the communities where they serve. And one of the reasons is because we have a very strong preference for veterans, which we would like to keep. But we need to keep it in a way that also allows, Ann-Margaret's, I'm just going to make up a person in her family that doesn't exist, but Ann-Margaret's biracial cousin who grew up in Gloucester to be on the police force and not to have preference from somebody from LA just because they were a veteran every single time, right? Sometimes that's okay, but if you do it every time, you'll never have Gloucester folks represented or local people of color either. And so, but that's complicated because myself, especially, I can speak for myself, I think it's true of many legislators, we want to continue to protect the rights and the benefits offered to our veterans, right? And so we decided to do that one as a commission, to really study what's being done that's being done well, that continues to help veterans, especially local ones, meaning like Commonwealth veterans, and doesn't show any reduction in, anyway, I'm getting into the details here. In my opinion, it wouldn't show reduction in local veterans, but other local people would have an equal chance, maybe, for example, against a vet from Hawaii or wherever they were from. No offense to Hawaiian vets, yay, everybody, thank you for your service. But you see what I'm saying? There's things that need to be balanced. And so we needed the commission for that, right? Because it wasn't ripe to just do it. We don't understand how to do it well. So the commission. So number one, certification, decertification. Number two, the civil service exam review commission. And those were the two big ones, right? That require like a lot of words in the legislation to really get it right. And then use of force was something that was not so much on the table until George Floyd. But we recognized in this 48 hours that we took to develop this 10-point plan, so that's the plan that I showed you with the 4 state, the 4 city, I'm sorry, the 4 federal, the 4 state, and the 2 city goals. Use of force had to get up there because, you know, we saw that 8 minutes and is it 46 seconds that the man couldn't breathe because the police officer's knee was on his neck. And that's not something that happens as much around here, but it should be banned, right? It should be banned, even though it is the practice of many police departments not to do that. But we've got a lot of different departments, a lot of different districts across the Commonwealth, and we want to make sure we're consistent about that. And there are a number of other things in use of force. So that could become a really huge thing, and people put a lot of hard work on that to figure out which things are the lowest hanging fruit given the circumstances that we're in right now, where there's a readiness to really review that for racial disparity and also just for inappropriate allowable behavior. And then finally, the Committee on Structural Racism. And that's where I did a lot of the drafting because I have been working with the Department of Corrections already on similar issues and had really great support and continue to have really great support from the Secretary, Tom Turco, who is retiring, which is always sad when you develop a good relationship, especially when you're new, and then that person retires. But he promises me the next person will be equally strong, and the Undersecretary has been fantastic too. And so those are the 4 components, and you probably now know more than you needed to know about at least the 2 of them that I spent a lot of time on. But it's important because a lot of other stuff gets added in because people rightly seize an opportunity. They see something going through, and they weren't part of our careful thought process with the Boston electeds of color. You know, so they're jumping in and they're saying, oh, qualified immunity and expungement and all this stuff that is actually on our list, especially my list is quite long. Ann-Margaret was kind in calling me a deep progressive. I'm actually like a pretty far lefty by most people's standards. You know, you got to know how to work on a team and how to get done what can get done. And even in my short tenure, it's not my first time doing work. I've done great work before coming. And so anybody that does any work anywhere, even if it's just in your own family, you know, you can't just make demands and pie in the sky. And there's a time for that, but there's a time where you got to close the deal. And so we have those 4 things in both the Senate and the House bill. So that's the good news. The challenging news is a bunch of stuff got stuck in there that is much more controversial. And when I say controversial, what I mean by that is they hadn't been part of the negotiations. So the last part of the story I'm going to tell you is what happened from the time the Boston electeds of color sat down together and made this plan, and July 31st, and where we're at today and what you can do. So what happened is we went on the state side to the Black and Latino caucus and said, here's what the Boston electeds of color have been thinking, give us your feedback, input. We put that together. And then our chairman, Chairman Carlos Gonzalez of Springfield, led us in meeting with all of the leadership, as well as Russell Holmes, because he had been doing the work with the governor. So we met with Governor Baker, we met with Speaker DeLeo, and we met with Karen Spilka, the Senate President. Everybody agreed on the 4 things. We started drafting, but importantly, we met with all 4 police unions, right? So our House and Senate members on the caucus, we only have 1 Senate member actually, met with delegates, met with all 4 police unions, and they negotiated the heck out of that thing. And they not only agreed to the 4 things, but some additional things that the police were also ready to do. And some departments were already doing, and the state police were already doing or planning to do. In response to George Floyd or previous to George Floyd, both of those things. So it was an exciting win. And I want you to just take that in for a second, because it can still be an exciting win because we got all that stuff. And in January, nobody except for members of the Black and Latino caucus and a few smattering of legislators had it as their top priority to get that done this year. I'm not going to say people didn't care about it, but there's 1,000 things to care about. Literally, we have 7,000 bills, and at least 1,000 of them any given legislator is going to be passionate about. And so the fact that those things got raised up to a priority level on everybody's radar, and that Massachusetts is ready to respond in a statewide level, that is structural change. And qualified immunity was a big sticking point, because what happened is the Senate put out a bill, and I'm not going to lie to you, and it's not fair because we don't have any state senators on the call to my knowledge. But you guys can call your state senator and ask them if Nika's point of view is different than theirs. but the Senate put out a bill that did not reflect our negotiations. I'm just going to say it straight. I've said it many times, keep saying it, water under the bridge at this point, but that is in fact what happened, right? Now, I am a big believer in abolishing all the aspects of our criminal justice system that are not serving the Commonwealth and everybody in it. But I'm also a big believer in the hard work that our first responders do, including our police force, and particularly when they step up and negotiate with us to make big changes that are going to be hard for them to implement on their rank and file. We need to honor that negotiation. And I have a negotiation background. I hate it when people list my education, but now I can point to that and say, some of that education was studying negotiation, which I did have to use in my career in various ways. And so it especially hurt me, just as a Black person who needs to see this stuff get done. It's not just, one thing ann-Margaret said to me, for me, this doesn't get done, and that's like very disappointing, but for your communities, it doesn't get done. And that's a different kind of pain. And I agree with that statement, and I appreciate her recognizing that. And then I'll add to that as a negotiator, you're like, this is a negotiation that could have won, and it still can, and it will. But how are we going to talk about it when it does? I want to talk about it as a win. So I'm the only lawyer on the Black and Latino caucus, and I was asked to do the research on qualified immunity, because when the Senate bill came out, the big sticking point that it had added in to the negotiation was doing something to limit qualified immunity. And qualified immunity is a very misunderstood doctrine. So I talked to the Senate drafter, I talked to the police expert. We had a great time. He told me it was one of the most fun conversations he's had, legal conversations he's had in 20 years. That's quite a compliment, I felt, coming from a legal scholar in qualified immunity. And I spoke with the ACLU as well, multiple times at length, because they were pushing qualified immunity now. And I have been supporting banning qualified immunity on the federal level because it's abused in other parts of the country, and I still support that. But my question is, why is this urgent? Because in Massachusetts, I'm not aware of any qualified immunity cases that have been egregious. Send me your cases. And the ACLU said, well, these are the cases, the ones you have. Well, the earliest one from Massachusetts that had anything to do with race, even potentially, was 1991, or the latest one, was 1991. So I asked, and that case arguably would have been dismissed anyway on other grounds. And so if it hasn't been a problem in the First Circuit in 30 years, why is it urgent? Now, qualified immunity gets abused, and that potential is always there. And a lot of people that were pro-qualified immunity when the doctrine came about feel like it hasn't worked towards their aims anyway. So what is it supposed to do? It's supposed to say, if a police officer is in a civil lawsuit, so it has nothing to do with criminal, if a police officer in a civil lawsuit relating to a violation of a person's constitutional right to freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, so that's a little narrow world, that's the world we're in that context, if there's no clearly established law to show that the officer's behavior was improper, then the case may be dismissed. Not shall be dismissed, but it can be dismissed. So that means you have to have really specific cases that have never happened before. And that is probably why nationally, only 3%, according to Senator Brownsberger, the drafter of the Qualified Immunity Amendment on the Senate side, only 3% of the cases that are dismissed in that universe that I just described are qualified immunity dismissals. And that's going to be less here in Massachusetts. I couldn't get the numbers on that, but we use qualified immunity less here than we do nationally. So we're talking about 3% of cases, which is already a small percent in a universe that's already a small percentage of cases. None of them have anything, none of them would have affected Breonna Taylor. None of them would have affected George Floyd or any of this long list of names. None of them would have affected a single criminal case. None of them would affect a case that actually goes to court civilly. And so this is why the majority, I'm not going to say every single person, but the vast majority of the Black and Latino caucus really is not budging on our commitment. Like, we need to get these 4 things done. Can we just get them done? We can talk about qualified immunity. That's an important doctrine to discuss later. And another source of confusion, because the police went ballistic when this came out. And I'm just going to say, I don't blame them. Now, I feel like it was overboard because there was a lot of miscommunication and misinformation that got spread because it took on a life of its own, you know. And but the real thing is, in my opinion, whatever, it's just my opinion, and that's how you can quote it as is Nika's opinion. They got dissed, right? They got dissed, as we used to say in the 80s growing up in my community. And they were angry and the trust was broken. And at that point, it's really hard to negotiate anything, isn't it? And I'm really grateful to the conference committee and others for recovering that. I think we've been rebuilding that trust back up. But that's a hard thing. And what a lot of police officers, even in my own district, they think qualified immunity is referring to their insurance. So I don't know if you've heard this idea that the police officers are going to lose their house, or if they don't have qualified immunity, they're exposed. But actually, the insurance is a doctrine called indemnification. It's completely disconnected from qualified immunity. And even if you ban qualified immunity, it has no effect on indemnification, which applies to all public servants, I think, or most, certainly to all police, and to Rep. Ferrante and myself. It applies to us as well in different ways. And so that misinformation has also created a lot of calls that go to our reps saying, I don't want to lose my house. What's the matter with you? I deserve this protection. I work really hard. I put my life on the front line. And all of that is true. But what is not true is that any of the amendments put forward would actually do that. So on all sides, there just became craziness. And that slowed it down. And we didn't get it done by July 31st. But the conference committee came together. The House, I think, responded fairly nimbly, given that I think most of us, even pretty close to the process, found out between hours and on the weekend about a bill that was released on a Monday morning. And there was a press conference at 9 or 10 in the morning, which I attended because I wanted to be supportive of our Senate member. But there were lots of folks, I'm going to be honest, that got yelled at before and after my attendance by me. So that's just the way the world works. You know, sometimes negotiations break down and you still got to pull together and work together. But the House responded with a bill that took the Senate bill, kept some limited version of the qualified immunity stuff, added, the Senate didn't actually get all 4 of the things in. It's like all this hoopla about qualified immunity, and that bill didn't have, I think it was civil service. The Structural Racism Commission just got in on an amendment. And so the House bill had all 4 things. And so now here we are with a conference committee. Now what I'm gonna say to you is a little unconventional in terms of the what can you do now? If you call a member of the conference committee now, or if you call Rep. Ferrante or your state senator, you should say thank you for your service. And that's it at this point. Like, nobody is holding this up. That's not what's happening now. So now they're trying to negotiate it and just get it done. People have elections. There's COVID. There's racial unrest. There's a lot of things going on. So in my district, at least, I don't know you guys, how you guys are talking with Rep. Ferrante about this. But in my district, people are saying, you know, I have a lefty district, so they're like, what is the leadership doing to sabotage this thing, you know, this policing bill? That is not happening. The leadership has been great. I'm a known critic when I feel that criticism is due. And the leadership has been fantastic. I've been deeply touched. Honestly, I have tears thinking about it right now. Even Speaker DeLeo, and we've shared words, generally privately, but when he said, I watched that George Floyd video 4 times, or however many times he said, and I've heard him say this multiple times, and I just realized we have to do something about this, not only in policing, but in every other area of government. And he's deeply committed to that. We have to dismantle structural racism. He said those words. And when I came in, I'm gonna tell you, I would say those words and I couldn't get people to say those words. They were like, you think we're racist? I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. And he is deeply committed to that, and every single other leader in the Democratic Party in the House that I have talked to is committed to it. And so we need to encourage them, tell them we know it's very hard. Most of them had to work through the summer. And some of them are doing other things. We have 5 conference committees that are running right now. So the leadership in particular has to be, you know, across all of those things, because we've got climate and healthcare and transportation bond bill and the eco dev bill, huge bills in conference committee that we're all trying to get done in this delayed session, delayed because of COVID. So that's the long, comprehensive story. Matt told me that you wouldn't be mad as long as we were done before 9. So,
if anybody has any questions, we've had a couple of questions in the chat here, but you've actually answered them. Councilor Holmgren asked about qualified immunity, and then you hit that on the head there. So I don't know if we have any other questions.
If there are no questions, I just want to just say something in closing.
Sure, absolutely, Rep.
I want to thank Rep. Elugardo again for coming, Nika for coming. And she talked about one of the things that I said to her, one of the things that she said to me, and I think this is important for those of us who want to be good allies, because I've told Rep. Elugardo and other African-American and Hispanic reps, I'm never gonna pretend to have had the same experiences that they had. And one of the things that she said to me as we were discussing the economic development bill, and I hope she won't get upset that I said this, I think it's okay to say this, but she said to me, being a good ally sometimes means you don't get to drive the bus. Sometimes you have to let somebody else drive the bus on a particular issue. And you have to, and no reverse racism or anything else intended, but sometimes you have to take a back seat on the bus to let somebody else drive the bus. And I think, and this is why I felt so strongly about having her come today to talk, and she did such a fabulous job, is I think sometimes as white progressives, sometimes we have to take a seat on the bus and let our African-American, our Black, our Hispanic, our Brown colleagues and colleagues not only in the House, but in advocacy, take the steering wheel and drive the issue. And so I can't thank you enough, Nika, for coming tonight, just to give that perspective that's uniquely yours in the position that you hold. so that all of us can back you up and all of us can support the Black and Latino caucus for what it is that, in your experience, you think is needed out of this bill and you think is needed out of this journey of reforming structural racism. So thank you.
Well, it's a real pleasure to speak to you, and I'm delighted that you wanted me to come out. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to coming up there and getting some lunch when
Yes.
multiple
Right.
things going on make that possible.